Welcome to the fourth video in this series covering the AQA GCSE History Unit, Conflict and Tension in Asia. This series of videos focuses on the Korean War. If you haven't watched the three previous videos on the origins of the Cold War, the invasion of South Korea in June 1950, and then the US response, I would really recommend starting with those. In today's lesson, we're going to be looking at the key question, how did the Korean War end? This video and all the other videos for this unit and beyond can be found on the hashtag HisTV YouTube channel, where lots of other history teachers have auto-recorded videos for their students. So, in today's lesson, we're going to look at 5 key events or stages in the Korean War that took place between 1950 and 1953 that ultimately led to the conclusion of the conflict. First, we're going to look at how a stalemate, or a situation where neither side is able to achieve victory, was reached following China's response to the UN forces' advance north in 1950. We're also going to look at how this stalemate led to US military turning towards its air power to try and break this stalemate. We're going to look at how the Soviet Union under Stalin increased its involvement. We'll then look at how peace talks began and stalled before a treaty was eventually signed by both sides in 1953. Finally, we're going to look at what this treaty meant for how North and South Korea would be divided, with a demilitarized zone established between the two in 1953. Let's begin by looking at how the two opposing sides ended up in a stalemate, with one force unable to overcome the other. After UN forces pushed north towards the Chinese border in October 1950, 200,000 Chinese soldiers crossed the Yalu River, the river that divided China and North Korea. These Chinese forces were supporting the North Korean army with weapons, tanks, and planes from the USSR. This response from China showed that MacArthur's promise to Truman that China would not join the war, even if provoked, was proved wrong. As a result, Truman had MacArthur sacked, even though MacArthur was seen by many Americans as a hero of the Second World War. Now, after repeated attacks by China, the joint forces of China and North Korea pushed the UN forces back down into South Korea, and they retook Seoul, the capital of South Korea. However, by March 1951, UN forces had halted this advance, fighting back to recapture Seoul once again, and this was the fourth and final time it had changed hands, showing how closely fought the center of the Korean Peninsula had been throughout this conflict. So, nearly a year into this conflict, the two sides were roughly back in the same territorial position as they had been when they started. This was around the 38th parallel, which is that red dotted line you can see in this picture, and it was the line that divided North and South Korea before the war began. So, with the stalemate having been reached around the 38th parallel, we're going to look now at how the US forces and the UN forces turned towards air power as a way to potentially break the deadlock between the two sides. By the end of 1951, this stalemate between Chinese and North Korean forces versus the UN forces had meant that the front line was holding stable around the 38th parallel. The two sides were facing each other from heavily fortified positions. These positions were made secure by a combination of artillery mines and barbed wire, which prevented the enemy from gaining any ground. This meant that this line was unbreakable by land-based forces. Therefore, the US turned to a new strategy. And so, in an attempt to break the stalemate and force the North Koreans to surrender, they decided to increase their use of air power. This involved US air raids bombing North Korean towns, cities, transport systems, factories, and military bases. They did this using high explosives and napalm. This use of air power had a devastating effect, and it has been calculated or estimated that as many as 1 million people, both soldiers and civilians, were killed in these air raids. This shows the immense human toll of this period of the conflict. Now, in response to this US turn towards air power, we're going to see in this next section how the Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, became increasingly involved in the conflict as a communist ally to China. So, a few weeks before China had become involved in the conflict, Chinese politicians had met with Stalin, the Soviet leader, to request his support as a communist ally and Cold War superpower. Stalin agreed and offered Soviet fighter planes and pilots, so long as they stayed in Chinese airspace and along China's border with North Korea. This was a way of avoiding the US discovering Soviet involvement. As a way of avoiding the US discovering this new direct form of Soviet involvement in the war, which could potentially lead to all-out war between the two, Stalin ordered for precautions to be taken to keep this secret. Some examples of these precautions include Soviet planes being painted with Chinese or North Korean markings, and also pilots being banned from speaking Russian on the radio. And in some cases, some even wore Chinese uniforms. There was a new Soviet fighter jet, the MiG-15, which was far superior to UN planes, and therefore the US forces offered a large reward to any North Korean, Chinese, or Russian pilot who was willing to defect and bring one of these planes to a US airbase. Several pilots did do this, in fact, and they received large cash rewards in exchange for their planes. From this point, towards the end of 1951, 2 years of aerial fighting ensued. The UN lost approximately 3,500 planes, whilst the North Korean, Chinese, and Soviet forces lost nearly 3,000 planes. So, how do we get from this point of Soviet involvement and aerial fighting from both sides to peace talks and eventually a treaty? Peace talks began in July 1951, though at this point the two sides failed to agree and fighting continued, as we saw in the previous slide. However, in 1952, the US President Truman was replaced by Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he was eager to end the war. This was one of his presidential pledges. So, eventually, on the 27th of July 1953, the UN, China, and North Korea signed a peace treaty that ended the fighting. The border that was put between an independent North Korea and South Korea would remain at the 38th parallel. Now, this is where it had been before the war and where stalemate had been reached in the middle of the war. However, there was one significant change to this pre-war border. There was a 3-kilometer wide demilitarized zone installed, and this would divide the two countries, and it would act as a buffer in the hope of preventing future wars. This demilitarized zone became a significant symbol of the conflict. But what did it look like? So, the demilitarized zone, or DMZ, separates North and South Korea, and it ran for about 240, or it still runs for about 240 kilometers from the mouth of the Han River on the west coast to the town of Kaesong on the east coast. Now, each side pulled its troops back 2 kilometers along each side of the military demarcation line. Now, the new border, protected by this demilitarized zone, roughly followed the 38th parallel. It incorporates territory on both sides of the military demarcation line, and this was the agreed border between the two countries. This militarized zone still exists today, demilitarized zone still exists today, and it stands as a decades-old relic of the Korean War and a symbol of the ongoing conflict or the hostilities between the two countries that we can still see today. So if we take a look at this map here, we can zoom in on the area that contained this demilitarized zone, which we can see in this yellow, wider area that we've got on this right-hand side of the map. The orange military demarcation line is the border itself. This was closest to the two sides would come to peace, with both sides maintaining a military presence along the borders of the demilitarized zone. So there we have it. Today we've looked at how a stalemate emerged following China's response to the UN forces' advance north in 1950. We've looked at how this stalemate led to the US military turning towards its air power to try and break this stalemate. We've looked at how the Soviet Union under Stalin increased its involvement, whilst avoiding doing so openly so as to avoid confrontation with America. We've then looked at how, from this point, peace talks began and stalled before a treaty was eventually signed by both sides in 1953. Finally, we've looked at what this treaty meant for how North and South Korea were divided, with a demilitarized zone established between the two in 1953. In the next video, we will look at how this end of the war had an impact on the nations involved. But for now, thanks for listening, and I hope this has been useful.